Daniel Reeves found the gap on his 4th day. 7 feet of space that shouldn't exist, hidden behind a wall that wasn't on any blueprint. When they finally broke through, he saw the corridor, long, dark, untouched for 37 years. And at the end of it, 4 doors, locked, silent, waiting. But it was the stain on the floor of the 4th room that made his blood run cold. This happened in 2001 at a recreation center where children played and families gathered. The building had been operating since 1952, and for all those years, this had been beneath their feet. The city had sealed it in 1964, erasing every record, every permit, every trace of what happened here. No explanation, no documentation, just a gap in history, like someone had tried to make it disappear. When the lab results came back, they confirmed what Daniel already feared. The stain was blood, human blood, and the walls told a story no one was supposed to find. This is what Daniel discovered beneath the Whitmore Recreation Center, and why, even now, some truths are too dark to acknowledge. If you need to know what was hidden in those rooms, stay with us. And if this is the kind of mystery that keeps you up at night, subscribe, because some stories refuse to stay buried. The Whitmore Recreation Center sits on the edge of a neighborhood that time forgot. Built in 1952 with federal community development funds, it was designed to serve the working families of Whitmore Heights, a dense pocket of row houses and corner grocers that bloomed after the war. The center had a gymnasium, meeting rooms, a small theater, and a basement devoted to mechanical systems and storage. For decades, it was the heart of the neighborhood. Kids learned to box there. Veterans held reunions. Local politicians gave speeches in the auditorium. But by 2001, Whitmore Heights had changed. The factories closed. Families moved. The recreation center limped along, sustained by grants and a small, dedicated staff. That spring, the board of directors secured funding for a full renovation. The plan was ambitious. Modernize the HVAC, rewire the building, repaint the gymnasium, and digitize every floor plan to create an accessible archive. That's where Daniel Reeves came in. Daniel ran a small surveying and drafting company. He'd worked on municipal projects before: courthouses, schools, fire stations. The Whitmore job seemed straightforward. He would spend a week measuring rooms, scanning old blueprints, and producing clean AutoCAD files. He started on a Monday in late March. The building was mostly empty. A few staff members worked in the front office. The rest of the space felt hollow, echoing. On his first day, Daniel walked the main floor, snapping photos and taking rough measurements. The layout was simple: a lobby, 2 wings, the gym in the back. Everything matched the 1952 plans he'd been given, but when he descended to the basement, he felt the first flicker of unease. The basement was a maze. Narrow hallways connected boiler rooms, storage closets, and utility alcoves. The ceilings were low. The fluorescent lights hummed, and the walls were a patchwork of materials: original brick, cinder block additions, drywall patches. It looked like the space had been remodeled multiple times, but inconsistently, as if different contractors had worked without coordinating. Daniel set up his laser distance meter and began mapping. He moved methodically, room by room, jotting measurements in a field notebook. By the end of the second day, he'd covered most of the basement. But on Wednesday afternoon, while measuring a utility corridor along the west wall, the laser gave him a strange reading. He was standing in a narrow hallway, aiming the device at what appeared to be a solid cinder block wall, but the laser registered a distance of 7 feet beyond where the wall should have ended. He frowned, recalibrated, and measured again. Same result. Daniel pulled out the 1952 blueprints. According to the original design, the west wall of the basement should have been the building's exterior foundation. There was no indication of additional space. He walked the hallway slowly, tapping the cinder blocks with his knuckles. They sounded hollow, He checked the floor. The tiles stopped cleanly at the wall, but the grout line seemed newer than the rest of the corridor. He photographed everything, then went upstairs to find the facilities manager. Her name was Linda Ortega. She'd worked at the center for 12 years and knew the building better than anyone. Daniel showed her the measurements and explained the discrepancy. Linda looked puzzled. She'd never noticed anything unusual about that hallway. As far as she knew, the basement ended where the walls ended, but she agreed to help him investigate. Together, they returned to the corridor. Linda studied the cinder blocks, then crouched to examine the grout. She admitted it looked strange. She suggested they contact the city's building inspector. The inspector arrived the next morning. His name was Paul Drennan, and he'd worked for the city for 23 years. He reviewed Daniel's findings, measured the gap himself, and consulted the original blueprints. He agreed there was an anomaly, but he wasn't alarmed. Old buildings often had quirks: sealed utility chases, abandoned ductwork, forgotten storage. He recommended they drill a small inspection hole to see what was behind the wall. If it was just dead space, they'd document it and move on. If it was something structural, they'd bring in an engineer. It seemed reasonable. They drilled the hole that afternoon. Paul used a masonry bit, pushing slowly through the cinder block. Dust puffed into the corridor. The drill punched through after 6 inches. Paul pulled the bit out and peered into the hole with a flashlight. He went silent. Daniel and Linda waited. Finally, Paul stepped back and said, "There's a hallway back there." Daniel felt his stomach tighten. A hallway meant construction, deliberate design, not a crawl space or a dead zone. Paul widened the hole with a hammer and chisel, clearing enough space to get a better look. The flashlight beam revealed a long, narrow corridor, walls painted institutional beige, floor covered in cracked linoleum. It stretched away into darkness. Paul estimated it ran at least 40 feet parallel to the basement's west wall. Linda asked the obvious question: why would someone seal off a hallway? Paul didn't have an answer. He took photos, made notes, and said he'd need to report this to the city's historical preservation office. Buildings from the 1950s sometimes had additions or modifications that weren't documented, especially if the work was done before modern permitting standards. He told Daniel and Linda not to touch anything until the city cleared it, but Daniel couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, he went home and pulled up the recreation center's construction records online. The city archives had digitized most municipal building files, though many were incomplete. He found the original 1952 blueprints, the same ones he'd been working from. He found permits for a roof repair in 1978, a boiler replacement in 1989, and window upgrades in 1995. But there was nothing about basement modifications. Then, he found the gap. In 1964, the recreation center had been temporarily closed. The closure lasted from mid-April to early July, 11 weeks. The records gave no explanation, no permits, no contractor invoices, no incident reports. Just a brief note in the city council minutes. Whitmore Recreation Center. Temporary closure for a facility assessment. After the closure, the building reopened and operations resumed as normal. Daniel printed the council minutes and brought them to Linda the next morning. She read them carefully. She'd heard stories about the center's early years, how it struggled with funding, how the neighborhood changed after the highway was built. But she'd never heard anyone mention a closure in 1964. She suggested they talk to some of the longtime community members. Maybe someone remembered. Linda made calls. She reached out to a few older residents who'd grown up in Whitmore Heights. Most had vague memories of the center from childhood, but nothing specific about 1964. Then she connected with a woman named Margaret Halford. Margaret was 81. She'd lived in the neighborhood her entire life. Her father had been a steelworker, her mother a school teacher. Margaret remembered the recreation center well, and when Linda mentioned the 1964 closure, Margaret went quiet. After a long pause, Margaret said she remembered. She was 19 that spring. She and her friends used to hang out at the center. Ping pong, dances, movie nights. One week in April, they showed up and found the doors locked. No signs, no explanation. Rumors spread. Some people said there had been a gas leak. Others claimed structural damage. A few whispered about something darker, though Margaret couldn't recall details. The closure lasted through the summer. When the center reopened, nobody talked about it. Everyone just moved on. Daniel asked if Margaret remembered anything unusual before the closure. She thought for a moment, then mentioned something odd. In the weeks before the shutdown, she'd noticed workers in the basement. They weren't regular maintenance staff. They wore coveralls, worked late, and didn't interact with anyone. Margaret and her friends joked that the center was building a secret bunker, a Cold War paranoia fantasy. But after the closure, she never saw those workers again. Daniel thanked Margaret and hung up. He sat in the empty gymnasium, staring at his notes. Workers, unscheduled construction, a sudden closure, and a sealed hallway that didn't exist on any official plans. He felt the edges of something larger taking shape, a pattern he couldn't yet name. Paul Drennan called later that afternoon. The city had reviewed the inspection photos and approved a controlled entry. They wanted to document the sealed corridor, assess its condition, and determine why it had been closed off. Paul would supervise. Daniel and Linda were welcome to observe. They scheduled the entry for the following Monday. Over the weekend, Daniel couldn't let it go. He drove to the public library and searched through old newspapers on microfiche. He found articles about the recreation center's opening in 1952, coverage of community events through the 50s, and scattered mentions in the 60s, but he found no coverage of the 1964 closure. It was as if the local press had ignored it entirely, or been told to. Monday arrived. Paul brought a contractor to remove a section of the cinder block wall. The work took an hour. When the opening was large enough, Paul stepped through, flashlight in hand. Daniel and Linda followed. The corridor was exactly as the inspection hole had revealed, long, narrow, and abandoned. The air was stale, but not foul. The linoleum floor was brittle and cracked, and along the left side of the hallway, spaced evenly, were 4 doors. The doors were wooden, painted the same institutional beige as the walls. Each had a small window at eye level, reinforced with wire mesh. Paul approached the first door and tried the handle. Locked. He shone his flashlight through the window. The room beyond was small, maybe 10 by 12 feet. Empty. Bare walls. A single light fixture on the ceiling. No furniture, no shelves, nothing. Daniel moved to the second door, also locked. He peered through the window. This room was identical to the first. Same dimensions, same emptiness. The third and fourth doors revealed the same thing. 4 rooms, perfectly uniform, sealed off, and forgotten. Linda asked the question they were all thinking. What were these rooms used for? Paul didn't speculate. He took photos, measured the corridor, and made notes. He said he'd need to bring in a locksmith to open the doors properly. They couldn't force entry without risking damage to potential historical evidence. He also wanted the city's historian to review the findings before they proceeded further. Back in the main basement, Daniel examined the construction of the cinder block wall that had sealed the corridor. The work was professional, not hasty. The blocks were laid evenly, the mortar clean. Whoever closed it off had taken their time. This wasn't an emergency measure. It was deliberate concealment. That night, Daniel searched for more information about the Whitmore Center's history. He found a reference to a 1963 federal grant program aimed at expanding community facilities in urban areas. Several recreation centers nationwide had received funding for basement-level additions, workshops, meeting rooms, storage. Whitmore Heights had applied and been approved, but the construction records were missing. If the basement had been expanded, there should have been permits, inspection reports, contractor invoices. Daniel found none of it. He contacted a researcher at the National Archives who specialized in mid-century municipal projects. The researcher was intrigued. She promised to look into federal grant disbursements for the Whitmore Center and get back to him. Daniel thanked her and returned to his drafting work, but his mind kept circling back to those 4 empty rooms. The locksmith arrived on Wednesday. His name was Ed Carver, a wiry man in his 60s who'd opened everything from safes to jail cells. Paul supervised as Ed worked on the first door. The lock was old but functional, a standard commercial mechanism. Ed had it open in minutes. They stepped inside. The room was exactly as it had appeared through the window. Small, empty. The walls were painted cinder block. The floor was bare concrete. The ceiling had a single recessed light, long dead. But there was something else. In the far corner, bolted to the wall, was a metal bracket. It looked like a shelf support, but there was no shelf. Just the bracket, about waist high, anchored firmly into the block. Paul photographed it. Linda crouched to examine the floor. She noticed faint scuff marks, parallel lines running from the door to the bracket, as if something had been dragged repeatedly. Daniel felt a chill. Ed moved to the second door. This lock opened just as easily. The room was identical. Same size, same emptiness, same metal bracket on the wall. The third room matched. But the fourth room was different. This room had 2 brackets, one on each side, and on the floor, near the center, was a dark stain. It was roughly circular, maybe 2 feet in diameter, faded, but unmistakable. Paul knelt and touched it with a gloved hand. The concrete was porous, the stain absorbed deep. He took samples, scraping the surface into an evidence bag. No one spoke. Daniel stepped out of the room. His pulse hammered. Linda followed, her face pale. Paul finished documenting the stain, then joined them in the corridor. He sealed the evidence bag and labeled it. He said he'd send the samples to a lab for analysis. Until they knew what they were dealing with, the corridor would remain restricted. Daniel asked if there were any other clues. Paul shook his head, but then Linda pointed to the ceiling. Near the end of the corridor, partially hidden by a conduit pipe, was a small metal grate. It looked like a ventilation cover. Paul climbed on a stepladder and removed it. Behind the grate was a narrow shaft, angling upward. He shone his flashlight into it, following the beam. The shaft appeared to lead to the main floor, possibly opening somewhere near the gymnasium or the auditorium. Paul made a note to trace the ventilation system. If the shaft connected to the main building, it might explain how air had circulated in the sealed corridor. But it also raised another question. If the corridor had ventilation, it meant someone intended for it to be occupied. The researcher from the National Archives called Daniel that evening. She'd found something. The 1963 federal grant for the Whitmore Center had indeed funded a basement expansion. But the project files were classified under a now-defunct interagency program called the Community Resilience Initiative. The program had been a Cold War-era effort to integrate civil defense infrastructure into public buildings. Fallout shelters, emergency communication hubs, storage for supplies. Daniel's breath caught. Fallout shelters. That could explain the sealed corridor, the empty rooms, the deliberate construction. But it didn't explain the stain, or the brackets, or why the project had been erased from public records. The researcher said she'd keep digging, but access to certain files required clearance she didn't have. She recommended Daniel contact the Federal Emergency Management Agency or the Department of Energy, both of which had absorbed Cold War civil defense records. Daniel thanked her and hung up, his mind racing. The lab results came back 10 days later. The stain on the floor of the fourth room was organic. Specifically, it tested positive for human blood. Old blood, degraded, but unmistakable. Paul Drennan called an emergency meeting with the city's legal team and the police department. Daniel and Linda were asked to provide statements. The corridor was officially declared a potential crime scene. Detectives arrived to re-examine the rooms. They brought in a forensic team with luminol and UV lights. The fourth room lit up. The stain on the floor was just the beginning. The walls showed spatter patterns, faint but detectable. The brackets tested positive for trace amounts of blood as well. The forensic team worked methodically, photographing everything, taking samples, documenting angles and distances. Daniel sat in the gymnasium, watching police move in and out of the basement. He felt numb. What had started as a routine mapping project had become something incomprehensible. Linda sat beside him, silent. She'd worked at the center for over a decade. She'd organized birthday parties in these rooms, coached youth basketball, comforted scared kids during storms, and all that time, this had been beneath her feet. The detective leading the investigation was a woman named Carol Fry. She was in her late 40s, calm and precise. She interviewed Daniel, asking about the discovery, the measurements, the timeline. She asked if he'd touched anything in the rooms. He said no, only looked. She nodded and moved on to Linda, asking similar questions. After the interviews, Detective Fry explained what they knew. The blood evidence suggested the rooms had been used for something violent, but the degraded state made it impossible to determine when. It could have been 1964. It could have been earlier. Without bodies, without additional context, they were operating in the dark. She said they'd continue investigating, but she warned them not to expect quick answers. Daniel asked if the corridor could have been part of a legitimate government program. Fry said it was possible. Cold War civil defense projects sometimes involved human testing, radiation exposure studies, psychological experiments, stress simulations. Many of those programs were later declassified and found to be unethical. If the Whitmore corridor had been part of such a program, the records might still be buried in federal archives. Over the next 2 weeks, Daniel tried to focus on finishing the mapping project, but his mind kept returning to the corridor. He contacted FEMA, requesting information about the Community Resilience Initiative. They had no records. He reached out to the Department of Energy. They confirmed the program existed, but said all related files had been transferred to the National Archives decades ago. He circled back to the researcher. She found references to the program in budget documents, but no operational details. Then, Daniel found a name. In a footnote of a 1965 congressional budget report, he saw a mention of Dr. Emil Voss, listed as a program coordinator for the Community Resilience Initiative. Daniel searched for information about Voss. There was almost nothing. A few academic papers from the 1950s on behavioral psychology and group dynamics. A brief biography in a university alumni newsletter noting his work with federal agencies. And then, silence. Daniel hired a private researcher to dig deeper. 2 weeks later, the researcher called. Dr. Emil Voss had died in 1983. He'd worked for the Department of Defense and later the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. His personnel file was restricted, but the researcher had found an interview Voss gave in 1972 to an obscure psychology journal. In it, Voss discussed his work on stress resilience conditioning in the early 1960s, describing experiments designed to test human endurance under controlled isolation. He mentioned facilities in select urban centers, but provided no specifics. Daniel felt sick. Stress resilience conditioning, controlled isolation, the empty rooms, the brackets, the blood. He called Detective Fry and shared what he'd found. She listened carefully, then said she'd forward the information to the federal investigators. She also told him something new. The ventilation shaft in the corridor did connect to the main building. It opened behind a false panel in the gymnasium's equipment room. Whoever designed the corridor had ensured it could be accessed discreetly. Linda called Daniel late one night. She'd been going through old center records, boxes of papers stored in a back office. She'd found something. A maintenance log from 1964, covering the weeks just before the closure. The log mentioned routine inspections, equipment checks, and one odd entry. Basement access restricted per federal directive. Daniel drove to the center immediately. Linda showed him the log. The entry was dated April the 10th, 1964. 5 days before the closure began. There was no explanation, no signature, just the note. Daniel photographed it and sent it to Detective Fry. The investigation stalled. Weeks passed. The police couldn't identify any missing persons reports from the area during the relevant time period. The forensic evidence, while disturbing, didn't connect to any known crimes. The federal agencies Daniel contacted stonewalled or claimed ignorance. The corridor remained sealed, now behind a locked steel door installed by the city. Daniel finished the mapping project. He delivered the final AutoCAD files to the Recreation Center board. They thanked him, paid his invoice, and never mentioned the corridor. The renovation moved forward. The gymnasium was repainted. The HVAC was upgraded. Life at the Whitmore Center resumed. But Daniel couldn't let it go. 6 months later, Daniel received a call from an unlisted number. The voice on the other end was elderly, male, hesitant. The man said his name was Arthur Leland. He'd heard about the discovery at the Whitmore Center through a former colleague. He said he needed to speak with Daniel in person. Daniel agreed. They met at a diner in a neighboring town. Arthur was in his 80s, thin and pale, hands trembling slightly. He ordered coffee, but didn't drink it. He stared at Daniel for a long moment, then asked, "How much do you know about the rooms?" Daniel explained what he'd found. The corridor, the blood evidence, the references to Dr. Voss, and the Community Resilience Initiative. Arthur listened without interrupting. When Daniel finished, Arthur nodded slowly. "I was there," Arthur said. "I worked for Voss." Daniel's heart raced. Arthur explained that in 1963, he was a young psychologist, fresh out of graduate school. He'd been recruited by a Department of Defense contractor to assist with behavioral research. The work was classified. He signed a non-disclosure agreement and was sent to various sites across the country. One of those sites was the Whitmore Recreation Center. The project, Arthur said, was designed to study human responses to isolation and stress. The goal was to develop protocols for training personnel who might face extreme conditions: POWs, deep cover operatives, astronauts. Volunteers were recruited, though Arthur admitted the recruitment process was ethically dubious. Some were low-income individuals offered money. Others were told they were participating in a government study to improve public safety. The corridor at Whitmore had been one of several facilities. Participants were placed in the small rooms for extended periods, sometimes days. They were monitored through the windows, subjected to psychological stress tests, isolation, sleep deprivation, disorientation. The brackets on the walls were for restraints, used when participants became uncooperative. Daniel asked about the blood. Arthur's face darkened. He said most participants endured the experiments and were released, but there were incidents: self-harm, violent outbursts. In one case, a participant had injured themselves severely trying to escape. Arthur didn't know if anyone had died, but he knew the program was shut down abruptly in 1964 after concerns about ethics and legality. The facilities were sealed, the records classified, and the participants paid off or silenced. Arthur said he'd carried the guilt for decades. He'd tried to forget, to justify it as Cold War necessity. But when he heard about the Whitmore discovery, he knew he had to speak. He gave Daniel a folder containing copies of his old research notes, de-identified participant logs, and a list of other sites where similar experiments had occurred. Daniel asked why Arthur hadn't come forward earlier. Arthur said he was afraid of legal consequences, afraid of retaliation, afraid his family would discover what he'd been part of. But he was old now, and he wanted someone to know the truth. Daniel thanked him. He took the folder and left the diner. He sat in his car for a long time, staring at the documents. Then he called Detective Fry. Fry reviewed the materials. She contacted federal authorities. An investigation was opened, but it moved slowly. The Department of Justice acknowledged that unethical Cold War-era experiments had occurred, but said most participants were deceased, and many records were lost. They offered a formal apology, but no accountability. The Whitmore corridor was documented as part of a federal research program, now defunct. The city installed a historical plaque in the Recreation Center lobby, noting the building's connection to Cold War civil defense efforts. It made no mention of the experiments, the blood, or the people who suffered there. Daniel attended the plaque unveiling. He stood in the back, watching city officials give speeches about history and resilience. No one mentioned Arthur Leland. No one mentioned the participants. The past, it seemed, had been sanitized. Daniel never returned to the Whitmore Recreation Center after that day. The mapping project was done. The mystery, as much as it could be, was solved. But the answers didn't bring peace. They brought a different kind of weight. Arthur Leland died 2 years later. Daniel attended the funeral. It was small, quiet. Arthur's family never learned about his role in the experiments. Daniel kept that secret, honoring Arthur's final request. The documents Arthur provided led to the identification of 3 other facilities. 2 had been demolished. 1, in a Midwestern city, was still standing, converted into a community college. Activists pushed for investigations, but progress was slow. The government acknowledged wrongdoing in general terms, but resisted specifics. Detective Fry retired. She told Daniel she'd done what she could. The case, such as it was, remained open, but inactive. No charges were filed. No justice was served. Linda Ortega left the Recreation Center in 2003. She couldn't walk those halls anymore without feeling the weight of what lay beneath. She moved to another city, started over. She and Daniel stayed in touch. Sometimes they talked about other things. Sometimes they talked about the corridor. Mostly, they didn't talk at all. Daniel still works as a surveyor. He maps buildings, measures rooms, drafts plans. But he approaches every project differently now. He looks for the gaps, the inconsistencies, the spaces that don't add up, because he knows that sometimes the walls we build aren't meant to protect. They're meant to hide. The Whitmore Recreation Center still operates. Kids play basketball in the gymnasium. Seniors take exercise classes. Families gather for community events. And in the basement, behind a locked steel door, the corridor waits. The rooms are empty. The lights are dark. But the history is there, sealed in concrete and cinder block, a reminder that the past is never as simple as we want it to be. Daniel thinks about the people who sat in those rooms. He wonders what they were promised, what they endured, what they carried with them afterward. He wonders if any of them are still alive, still carrying the weight. He wonders if they ever found peace. He doesn't have answers. But he knows this. The truth doesn't always set us free. Sometimes it just shows us how much we've chosen not to see. Late at night, when Daniel can't sleep, he pulls out the folder Arthur gave him. He reads the de-identified logs, the clinical descriptions of fear and suffering rendered in attached scientific prose, and he feels the same chill he felt standing in that corridor, staring at the stain on the floor. Because the Whitmore corridor wasn't an anomaly. It was a choice. A decision made by people who believed the ends justified the means, who thought secrecy could erase accountability. And in a way, they were right. The corridor was sealed. The records were hidden. The participants were forgotten. But forgetting isn't the same as erasing. The past remains, buried but not gone, waiting for someone to ask the right question, to take the right measurement, to notice the gap in the wall. Daniel noticed, and now, so do you. The Whitmore Recreation Center still stands. The plaque still hangs in the lobby, and somewhere, in a federal archive or a locked filing cabinet, the full story waits. Maybe one day someone will find it. Maybe one day the truth will be complete. Until then, we're left with fragments. A sealed corridor, 4 empty rooms, a stain on the floor, and the haunting certainty that what we found was only the beginning. If you've stayed with us through this dark journey, consider subscribing. These stories need to be told, and your support ensures they won't be forgotten. Drop a comment below if you've ever discovered something hidden in a familiar place. Sometimes the most unsettling mysteries are the ones we walk past every day.